Every morning, without fail, she slipped through the diner's door. Marcus had seen her long enough to recognize the worn jacket draped over her shoulders, the quiet fatigue in her eyes, the way she never seemed to have much money. She always chose the cheapest item on the menu, and some days she couldn't even cover it. Marcus never called attention to it. Instead, he would adjust the total silently, sometimes leaving a little extra beneath her plate, a subtle act that required no acknowledgement. He told himself it was trivial, a simple gesture, the kind any decent person might make without a second thought. But the consistency of her presence was comforting in a way he hadn't realized until it was gone. Marcus had been running the morning shift at Carver's Diner for nearly 6 years. Over time, he had mastered the rhythm of invisibility, the art of blending into a routine so completely that he became part of the backdrop. He arrived before sunrise, started the first pot of coffee, wiped down the counters, and arranged the tables exactly the same way every day. The diner itself was unremarkable, sitting quietly on a corner of the city. Nothing flashy, nothing that left an impression, just a place people passed through on their way to work, rarely looking back. Marcus fit perfectly into that environment. He was not someone meant to be remembered. Once in his late 20s, he had dreamed of more. He had trained in a real kitchen, not one that served reheated soup and scrambled eggs, but one where creativity mattered. A chef had praised his instincts, calling them rare and unteachable. For a while, Marcus believed him. Then life quietly diverted, as it does, and the path he had hoped for simply closed. He never spoke of that. He came to work, did his job, went home. That was enough, or at least it had been long enough for him to stop questioning it. She first appeared on a Tuesday in early October. At first, Marcus barely noticed her, just another customer moving through the door. She chose the table by the window, the one with the wobbly leg that regulars usually avoided. She lingered over the short menu longer than seemed necessary. When Marcus approached, she asked for the smallest coffee and a single slice of toast. She counted out her coins carefully and left a tip that barely registered, a few cents at most. Marcus didn't think much of it. The next morning she returned, and the day after that. By the end of the week, Marcus knew her order before she even sat down. He started noticing small details. Her jacket was too thin for the autumn chill, her bag looked patched and frayed, and she never used a phone, maybe didn't even have one. She would sit with both hands wrapped around her cup, staring out the window as if she was solving a problem that had no clear answer. Eventually, Marcus learned her name was Elena, not from her directly but from a debit card she used one slow morning. Elena Brooks. The name meant nothing to him then. Some mornings her card would be declined. The first time it happened, she looked at him without embarrassment, just a quiet acceptance, as if certain frustrations weren't worth feeling. Marcus shrugged it off, blaming the machine for being finicky. She thanked him softly and went back to her seat. After that, he started making subtle adjustments without thinking of them as acts of kindness. Sometimes her toast was doubled at no extra charge. Her coffee often appeared before she ordered it. On the mornings her card failed, he quietly marked her bill as paid and moved on. He convinced himself it was easier that way, and financially insignificant given how slow mornings usually were. What he hadn't expected was the way she began watching him. A glance lingered a little too long, the stillness in her posture when he moved around the diner. Most people wouldn't have noticed. But Marcus, used to tracking the small details of the room, realized she was observing him carefully, trying to understand something about him without asking a single question. By November, she had become part of his mornings, like the hum of the coffee machine or the familiar creak of the door in the cold. Marcus didn't think about her absence when she wasn't there. She was just a quiet presence that gave Tuesday mornings their shape. Then one day she didn't arrive. He noticed at 7:45 her usual time. He waited first until 8, then 8:30, finding small distractions to occupy his hands while constantly glancing toward the door. By 9:00, he poured her coffee himself, set it on the counter, and then poured it out, feeling absurd for even caring. There was no logical reason for his unease. She owed him nothing, and he owed her nothing. They had never spoken beyond orders and small courtesies. Yet her absence left a weight he couldn't shake, lodged quietly beneath his chest. And then at 9:15 the door opened, and it wasn't her. Instead of Elena, 4 men in dark suits stepped into the diner, moving with a calm certainty that made the space feel suddenly smaller. These were not people who belonged in a quiet corner cafe. Their clothes were too sharp, too precise. 2 lingered by the door, scanning the room with professional detachment, while the other 2 approached the counter. The man in front was older, silver at his temples, carrying a leather briefcase that seemed worth more than Marcus made in months. He didn't glance at the menu, his eyes fixed on Marcus with the precision of someone who had already confirmed exactly who he was looking for. "Marcus Hale," the man asked. Marcus set down his cloth. "That's me." "I'm Raymond Stokes," the man said, extending a card with deliberate care. "I'm an attorney. We need to speak privately. It concerns a matter of legal importance regarding Elena Brooks." Marcus looked from the card to the men, then to the empty table near the window with its wobbly leg, the coffee cup he'd set out still untouched. Marcus followed Stokes out to a sleek black car waiting at the curb. The two men who had remained by the door came along, leaving the other two behind, a detail that Marcus noticed but couldn't yet interpret. The law office sat high above the city, on the 14th floor of a building Marcus had passed countless times without ever entering. The lobby gleamed with marble floors and a reception desk that acknowledged him with polite, practiced indifference. Stokes led him to a conference room overlooking the city skyline. A single folder and a bottle of water sat on the long table. Marcus felt the odd discomfort of wearing a diner apron to a place like this. Stokes opened the folder without preamble. Elena Brooks was not struggling. She was not short on money, Stokes began. Marcus listened, stunned, as the attorney explained that her card had been deliberately kept at a low balance by design. Elena had been the CEO of a large, privately held company, and she had died 4 days ago after a terminal diagnosis. Her estate, including her business and personal assets, named Marcus Hale as the primary beneficiary, with directives for how parts of it were to be used. Back at home, Marcus sat at his kitchen table, coat still on, staring at the envelope Stokes had given him. Inside was Elena's letter, 4 pages of neat, compressed handwriting, precise yet urgent. She began by acknowledging the difficulty of her message. There was no easy way to deliver it. She didn't ask for forgiveness or pity. Instead, she wrote with an honesty that felt sharper than apology ever could. She explained that 14 months earlier, when her terminal diagnosis became certain, she had decided how to spend her remaining time. After decades in power, surrounded by people who responded to her for what she represented, she wanted something real before the end. She had visited many places, observed many people, but what she found at Carver's diner was different. For 6 weeks she had watched Marcus quietly, noting that his kindness required no performance, no calculation, no expectation of reward. It simply existed. That, she wrote, moved her more than she expected. Elena had chosen Marcus not to reward him, but because he was already embodying the values she hoped to preserve. The final pages detailed her instructions. Funds from her estate were to support programs she had never been able to complete herself, helping the homeless and terminally ill with inadequate support. She trusted him to carry it forward. The letter ended with a single line Marcus read twice. "I didn't choose you to reward you. I chose you because you were already doing the thing. I just wanted to make sure you could keep doing it." Marcus sat silently, the weight of her words pressing him into stillness. Outside, the afternoon light had shifted, softening at the edges of the city skyline. The weeks that followed unfolded in a mix of confusion and quiet intensity. The legal machinery moved swiftly in some areas and ground to a halt in others. Raymond Stokes called regularly, updating Marcus on every development. The board, led by Victor Aldrin, Meridian Group's longtime COO, formally contested the will. They questioned Elena's mental state when she amended her estate, suggested potential undue influence, and scrutinized Marcus's interactions with her, as if that could invalidate her decisions. Marcus had no experience with boards, fiduciary obligations, or corporate procedures. Every term and protocol felt like a wall he couldn't climb, yet despite the chaos and expense surrounding him, he clung to the routine of the diner. Early mornings were the only hours that still felt entirely his. He brewed coffee, set tables, and kept watch on the door, holding on to the rhythm that had grounded him for years. His manager noticed his distraction and asked twice if everything was all right. Marcus responded both times with a curt yes, ending the conversation. Inside, a quiet storm of self-doubt and disbelief grew. He realized the world Elena had inhabited, the one filled with power, wealth, and influence, was a realm he didn't belong in. He was suddenly acutely aware of his own ordinariness, standing in the weight of someone else's trust. When the day of the board meeting arrived, Marcus showed up in a suit he had bought just 2 days earlier. Nothing in his wardrobe had ever felt suitable for a room like this. He sat at the end of the long conference table, surrounded by Meridian's directors and lawyers. For 45 minutes, Victor Aldrin's attorneys laid out a meticulous case for why Marcus had no claim, no authority, and no right to touch Elena's estate. Their arguments were precise, rehearsed, and intimidating. Aldrin himself spoke little, letting the attorneys do the work. The other board members waited with the kind of calm detachment that comes from having already made up their minds. When Marcus finally had a chance to respond, a subtle gesture from one of the lawyers signaled that his words were expected to be irrelevant. He glanced at the folder before him, the will, Elena's letter, and the framework he had prepared with Stokes. But he understood in that instant that legal arguments would not win this room. Instead, he chose a different approach. He began simply, recounting a Tuesday morning in early October at Carver's diner. He described Elena's worn jacket, her careful counting of coins, the wobbly-legged table she always chose, and the small coffee and toast she ordered. He spoke of her quiet dignity, the way she faced her limited means without shame, and the 6 weeks she had spent observing him without conversation or request. Marcus told them how he had quietly refilled her coffee, added toast, and marked her bill as paid when necessary, not as an act of heroism, but because that was what he always did for anyone in need. He spoke plainly, without embellishment, letting the ordinary nature of these gestures convey their meaning. It was in these small, unremarkable acts that Elena had found what she had been seeking: authenticity. Marcus picked up Elena's letter from the folder but didn't read it aloud. Instead, he explained in his own words what it conveyed. She had watched people for weeks, looking for the absence of performance, someone whose actions weren't performed for show, for approval, or for gain. What she saw in Marcus wasn't exceptional flair or calculated kindness. It was consistency, the quiet integrity of someone whose care was structural, instinctive, built into who he was. He told the board that Elena hadn't left him her estate out of pity or sentimentality, nor because she had exhausted other options. She had observed him carefully and concluded that he would use what she left the way she would have, had she had more time. That was why she chose him. Marcus then opened the folder with the program framework and walked the board through it methodically. He outlined the 2 initiatives Elena had outlined, one to provide transitional housing and support services for people experiencing homelessness, and the other to coordinate care for those facing terminal illness without sufficient support. He spoke clearly, without hurry or apology, letting the focus remain on the work Elena had started, the work he was now entrusted to continue. The room fell silent when Marcus finished presenting the framework. It wasn't the tense, waiting silence of people already decided on an outcome. It was more nuanced, layered with attention and reconsideration. Carla Voss scribbled notes on her pad without lifting her eyes. 2 board members exchanged a subtle glance Marcus couldn't decipher. Victor Aldrin studied him intently, then leaned back slightly, letting the pause speak volumes without a single word. 2 days later, after additional procedural discussions between Stokes and Voss, the board held its formal vote. They decided to honor Elena's will as written. The contest was withdrawn. And Marcus received the news over the phone from Stokes, delivered in the same calm, precise tone the attorney had used throughout. The next steps would involve arranging the official transition for oversight of the programs. Marcus hung up and sat for a while in the diner's back office, a familiar space where he had eaten lunch for 6 years. The room smelled of coffee, dish soap, and old paper. Then he returned to the front and finished his shift, knowing that the months ahead would be both complicated and unexpectedly straightforward. Marcus never assumed a formal role in Meridian. That had never been Elena's intention, and now that the board had accepted the will, no one pushed him toward it. Instead, he focused on overseeing the 2 programs she had outlined, working with a small team of administrators that Stokes helped assemble. These were people who understood the structures and procedures. He didn't need to pretend. What he brought to the table was different, harder to define. The ability to see beyond policies and spreadsheets to the people who would actually benefit. He asked whether a program would reach those it was meant to help, or vanish into bureaucracy before it got there. That perspective became a tangible, valuable contribution. And through it all, he kept the diner. That decision never felt like a consolation prize. The diner was where he had learned, without realizing it, the qualities Elena had observed in him. Leaving it never seemed right. Marcus made one subtle change at the diner. The table by the window, the one with the wobbly leg that regulars always avoided, he repaired it. Once steady, he placed a small reserved sign on it, not for any particular customer but as a quiet acknowledgement of something worthy of being honored. When his manager asked about it, Marcus said it was for a regular who hadn't returned, and that was the end of it. No more explanation was needed. Weeks later, on a cold Wednesday morning in late February, a young woman entered alone. She was clearly aware of the chill, her coat too thin, and she carried the careful hesitancy of someone unsure of her welcome but used to masking it. She glanced around the diner, then studied the menu, finally taking a seat at the counter rather than the window table. Marcus approached as usual. She ordered the smallest coffee and asked for the cheapest breakfast. Counting the coins in her pocket, she didn't look embarrassed, just measured. Marcus quietly added a slice of toast to her order and brought the coffee, topping it up before she asked. She stayed about 40 minutes, then left with a soft, sincere, "Thank you." The morning continued in its familiar rhythm, the door opening and closing, coffee brewing, light shifting through the window. For a brief moment, the reserved sign caught the sun, and the small gesture felt quietly complete. In the days that followed, Marcus settled into the rhythm of managing Alina's programs. It wasn't what he had ever imagined for himself, and yet it had a strange sense of purpose. He didn't run a company, and he didn't want to. What he did was ensure that the initiatives she had designed reached the people they were meant to help. One program provided transitional housing and support for those experiencing homelessness. The other coordinated care for people facing terminal illnesses without enough resources. He worked alongside a small team of administrators, professionals who understood the structures, the budgets, and the systems. Marcus's role was different. He asked the questions no one else asked. Would this actually reach the person who needed it, or would it dissolve into bureaucracy? His perspective, shaped by years behind the diner counter, proved unexpectedly valuable. And through it all, he kept the diner. It wasn't a consolation or a fallback. It was the place where he had learned, without realizing it, the quiet consistency Alina had recognized in him. He wasn't ready to leave, nor was he sure he should. The diner had become a classroom, a sanctuary, and a reminder of why her trust mattered. Marcus made one small change to the diner. He repaired the wobbly table by the window and placed a modest, reserved sign on it. Not for anyone in particular, but as a gesture of holding space, for something or someone worthy of being remembered. When his manager asked about it, he said simply, "For a regular who doesn't come in anymore," and that was enough. Months later, on a cold Wednesday morning, a new young woman entered the diner. She moved cautiously, aware but guarded, and chose a seat at the counter rather than the window table. Her coat was too thin for the weather, and she counted her coins with the same quiet precision Marcus had seen before. Without a word, he brought her coffee and toast, refilling her cup before she asked. She stayed for 40 minutes, leaving with a simple, sincere, "Thank you," the way someone does when words carry more weight than they seem to. Marcus returned to his rhythm. The mornings continued, the door opening and closing, coffee brewed and poured, sunlight shifting across the room. And the window table, fixed and reserved, caught the light just so, a quiet testament to what had been entrusted, observed, and understood long before anyone else could see it. The mornings at Carver's diner had a rhythm that Marcus had come to rely on. He arrived before the city woke, brewed the first pot of coffee, wiped down the counters and arranged the tables with careful precision. It was quiet work, predictable and unremarkable, and that was exactly the point. Here he was just another part of the background, a fixture as ordinary as the hum of the refrigerator or the squeak of the door when it swung open. But then Alina arrived. She was a small disruption in his otherwise steady pattern, a presence that slowly demanded attention without asking for it. Every day she took the same table, counted out coins with exacting care and left barely a tip. Yet Marcus noticed, the thin jacket in October, the patched bag, the way she stared at the street as though unraveling a puzzle that had no solution. There was nothing performative about her or him, and in that quiet, ordinary exchange, a fragile understanding grew between them. He started making small, almost invisible changes for her. Coffee ready before she asked, an extra slice of toast, bills quietly covered when her card failed. He didn't see it as kindness. It was easier than watching her struggle, easier than the alternative. Yet it was enough to make her pause, to watch him the way one studies something rare, something that exists simply because it does, not because it must. By November, Alina had become part of the diner's morning rhythm, as natural as the hiss of the espresso machine or the way the door creaked when the temperature dropped. Marcus didn't think about her absence on other days. She was just a fixture. A quiet constant in the routine that made Tuesdays feel like themselves. Then one morning she didn't appear. At first he waited, telling himself she was simply late. He glanced at the door repeatedly, found reasons to check the street, and even poured her coffee before realizing he had no reason to. Yet the emptiness of her absence settled somewhere low in his chest, insistent and unshakable. At 9:15 the door opened, but it was Alina. 4 men in sharp suits entered with the calm certainty of people used to control. 2 stationed themselves by the entrance, eyes sweeping the room like trained observers. The other 2 approached Marcus, their steps deliberate. The one in front, older with streaks of silver in his hair, produced a card and introduced himself. Raymond Stokes, attorney. "We need to speak with you privately," he said, his tone precise, leaving no room for discussion. "It concerns Alina Brooks." Marcus's mind spun. The cup he had set out for her still sat on the table untouched, a small monument to the morning that had already changed. He followed Stokes out, unaware of the weight that was about to descend on him. The law office was sleek, modern, and intimidating. Marcus had passed the building countless times but never entered. Stokes led him to a glass-walled conference room where a long table gleamed under the overhead lights. A folder and a glass of water waited for him, nothing more. Marcus sat, suddenly conscious of his worn clothes, feeling out of place among the polished surfaces. Stokes began calmly. "Alina Brooks was not what you believed her to be," he said. Marcus listened, trying to absorb each word. Alina hadn't been struggling financially. Her declining debit card, a deliberate choice maintained at a low balance for reasons explained in the letter she left behind. He slid the sheet across the table. Marcus read it quickly. Alina Brooks was the CEO of Meridian Group, a private company with vast holdings in healthcare, real estate, and logistics. She had run it for 11 years and 14 months ago learned she had a terminal neurological condition. She had passed away 4 days prior, quietly and on her own terms. Marcus's mind flickered to the diner, the table with the wobbly leg, the cup she held between her hands, the mornings of silence and simple rituals. None of it seemed to fit with what he was hearing, yet it was true. Stokes spoke with the same steady precision. Alina's estate, including her stake in Meridian Group, several properties and various financial assets, was largely bequeathed to Marcus Hale. The letter outlined her wishes clearly. She hadn't chosen him out of pity or convenience. She had observed him quietly and concluded he would act as she would have, using her resources to continue the work she couldn't finish. Before Marcus could digest it all, another attorney entered, Carla Voss. Sharp-featured and direct, she represented a coalition of Meridian's board members and minority stakeholders. Their concern was simple. Marcus, a diner waiter, had no obvious connection to a woman of Alina's stature. They questioned the independence of her decisions and implied undue influence. Marcus understood without needing the words to be explicit. They wanted to prove he had no right to what Alina had left him. Shaken but silent, he followed the details, filing them away while trying to reconcile the simple mornings at the diner with the complex legal storm now surrounding him. Back at his small apartment, Marcus opened the envelope Stokes had handed him. Inside was Alina's letter, 4 pages, neat and precise, written in a careful, flowing hand. She began by acknowledging the awkwardness of how the information would reach him, admitting there was no clean way to explain her choices. She wasn't asking for forgiveness. Her tone was honest, direct, almost clinical. Alina explained that 14 months earlier, after receiving her terminal diagnosis, she had decided how she wanted to spend the remainder of her time and what legacy she wanted to leave. She had spent years watching how people responded to her title, her wealth, her influence. She had seen superficial kindness, calculated gestures, and empty deference. She wanted something real, unpretentious, and unperformed. Her discovery came in the quiet mornings at Carver's diner. She had watched Marcus for 6 weeks, noticing the way he moved, the small acts of care he performed without expecting recognition. He wasn't performing, he wasn't doing it for attention, for self-satisfaction, or for anyone else. He was simply kind because it was who he was. That, she wrote, was what moved her. The last page outlined her instructions. Marcus was not to run her company. That wasn't his path, nor her intention. Instead, she entrusted him with the power to direct parts of her estate toward work she couldn't finish, supporting people experiencing homelessness and individuals facing terminal illness without adequate resources. She had provided all the legal documentation and trusted him to carry it out responsibly. The final line struck Marcus deeply. "I didn't choose you to reward you. I chose you because you were already doing the thing. I just wanted to make sure you could keep doing it." He folded the letter carefully, placed it back in the envelope, and sat quietly, letting the weight of her trust settle over him. The apartment was dim, the late afternoon light pushing the edges of the room into muted orange. He hadn't eaten since morning, hadn't moved, just sat with the extraordinary clarity of what she had seen and what she had believed he could do. The following weeks were a strange mix of chaos and routine. Marcus found himself pulled into the unfamiliar world of lawyers, board members, and formal procedures. Raymond Stokes kept him updated, patiently explaining each development, while Alina's former company board, led by Victor Aldrin, formally contested the will. Questions arose about her cognitive capacity, the influence of Marcus, presence in her life, and whether the bequest was made freely. Marcus didn't understand the intricacies of corporate law or fiduciary obligations. Each phone call, each meeting, felt like stepping onto a stage without knowing the script or the role he was supposed to play. He had no prior experience in negotiations, no familiarity with boardroom protocols, no idea how to speak to people who had spent decades navigating that world. And yet, through it all, he kept returning to the diner. The mornings there were his anchor. He brewed coffee, arranged the tables, wiped the counters, and watched the door. That familiar rhythm reminded him of who he was, of the ordinary life that had taught him the quiet, structural kindness Alina had recognized. He didn't discuss the legal battles with anyone. His manager noticed his distraction and asked twice if he was all right. Both times Marcus answered yes, in a tone that ended the conversation. As the legal pressure mounted, he realized something essential. The world Alina had inhabited had little room for him. He couldn't navigate boardrooms, draft legal arguments, or perform in a world governed by wealth and influence. But that wasn't the point. Alina had trusted him with something deeply real, and his only way to honor that trust was to be exactly who he had been at the diner, using what he knew how to do: care for people in a tangible, meaningful way.